Last week, the People's Republic of China celebrated its 70th birthday in Beijing with a gigantic party, and an impressive display of strength, and apparently with the participation of an enthusiastic and patriotic populace. In Hong Kong on the same day, the only place in the People's Republic where people are free to express themselves, the city was besieged by riots and street demonstrations, apparently with an angry populist support. Now, these are complex events to interpret. The patriotism on display in Beijing was not false, but there is a question of how deep it sticks. And also the anger in Hong Kong was not false, but there is a question of what it could lead to. In both these cases, behind the patriotism and the anger are sections of the populations who disagree, who in Beijing do not cheer, and who in Hong Kong want stability. Today's regime in Beijing is what I have called the perfect dictatorship. A dictatorship so smooth and effective that it in some ways does not even look dictatorial. Now that is bad news for Hong Kong, which is destined to be fully incorporated into the People's Republic, which is what the demonstrators there do not want. The regime in Beijing has confounded the world by, on the one hand, opening up economically and generating massive economic progress, but then at the same time, with the other hand, not opening up politically, but instead clamping down and tightening all the screws of dictatorship. Now this is a monumental non-expectation, and it is a non-expectation that we in the Western world are still struggling with understanding, totally against our way of thinking of the logic of development and modernization. Now, there has been monumental improvements in the standard of living of many or most Chinese people. And it is therefore relevant to ask, as we are doing today, whether there is a lesson to be learned from the People's Republic about governance, development, and progress. And my answer to that question is in 2 points. First, if I were a dictator somewhere in the world today, I would head directly to Beijing to learn how it is really done. And if I were a democratic leader somewhere in the world today, I would stop kowtowing to the Chinese regime and speak directly to the Chinese leaders about their aggression in the world and their repression at home. The 20th century invented a form of government that became called totalitarianism. And that form of government was imposed on the German people during the Nazi regime and on the Russian people under the Stalinist regime. Now we should today remember many things, but at least 2 things about these experiences. And the first is that in both cases, there was a great deal of domestic support behind the repressive regimes. A great deal of domestic support. In Germany and in Russia. A great deal of enthusiastic and patriotic support behind those regimes. And the other thing to remember is that these regimes had intellectual support from abroad, from well-meaning observers who admired their order and their delivery, and many of whom also were attracted to their ideologies. We don't like to remember this today. Democracy does not make life easy. it also asks a lot of people, of us. It asks a lot of us. Basically, it asks us that we not be selfish in the way we live in our communities. In many ways, it is easier to leave governance to the autocrats and to get on with life. That is the contemporary Chinese patriotism. Autocracy has always seemed attractive and has always had detractors in free societies. The autocrats are in control in Beijing, and it is entirely predictable that they are rewarded with patriotism at home and with praise from followers abroad. Now, although the patriotism in Beijing was not false, there is more to be said about it. The leaders in Beijing, who always claim that they have the support of the people behind them, do not for a moment trust or believe in that support, not for a second. They live by Lenin's law that trust is good, but control is better. The patriotism that is on display is the product of, and I here use the words of Ian Johnson in a recent article in the New Review of Books, their gargantuan security and information control apparatus. The Beijing government invests more money in domestic security than in external defense. Strict censorship is applied in all aspects of information, down to museum displays. 2 million internet opinion analysts control what circulates on the web. 2 million people sit and control what circulates on the web. And they use a relentless flow of propaganda in which the rascal's ultimate tool takes central stage, and that is the tool of nationalism. This perfect dictatorship is invisible where it does not need to be visible, but is without restraint where it needs to make itself felt, such as currently in the network of re-education and concentration camps that are maintained throughout Xinjiang. Now, the ultimate ambition of totalitarianism, and I here lean on the learnings of the great Hannah Arendt, the ultimate ambition is to make the oppressed love their oppressors and their oppression. And in Beijing last week, it for a moment looked as if the People's Republic has succeeded in this. It's only that the leaders themselves do not for a moment trust that they have. Now, the regime claims that it, in return for the obedience it extracts from the people, rewards them with progress and prosperity. In fact, it has delivered much less than it boasts. East Asia is a region of economic miracle stories. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The reason the world is starry-eyed about China is not that their development experience is anyway unique. It is not. It is not exceptional. It's that it is so big. We are blinded by the bigness of the Chinese economy. It's not particularly effective. It has not stood out in performance or development in East Asia. It is not in any way exceptional in the effectiveness of its delivery. It is not, but it is big. The glamorous development stories in the region are those of South Korea and Taiwan. In the same 70 years period that was celebrated in Beijing last year, South Korea and Taiwan have progressed from even deeper poverty than from where the People's Republic started, to today being first high-income countries with a European-level standard of living, and secondly, having made themselves well-functioning, rule-of-law democracies. The People's Republic, by comparison, has delivered only a fourth of that development. Economically, lifted the country up to a level of middle income in the world, not as the neighbors to high income, and politically regressed to neo-totalitarianism. In our events here today, we are talking the language of crisis, chaos, and lack of meaning when we talk about democracy. We should, I think, be very careful with that language. There are alternative systems out there. And when we look to those systems, we should appreciate what we have. Democracy is always a mess. But normal democratic mess is not crisis and is not chaos. To understand that, it is useful to look to the alternative. What was on offer in Beijing last week was the opposite of mess, perfect regimental order. Now that kind of order has historically attracted admiration, and so it does today. The experience tells me that we must defend democracy. And to do that, we must take great care with the language we use in discussions about democracy. We must never make fun of democracy for its mess. Mess is the other side of the coin of freedom. My inspiration here is the great American theorist Robert Dahl, who during his life was a radical critic of American democracy as it functioned, and at the same time always an uncompromising defender of American democracy. It is that combination we must manage. The criticism of democracy in work within a context of uncompromising defense of democracy as the best alternative form of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stein, for setting this scene with your thought-provoking and engaging talk. So now it's up to you. Has anyone a question? And before we start with the Q&A round, it would be great, Stein, just come here. It would be great if you could introduce yourself briefly and keep your questions to the point, because time is ticking.
Hello, thank you very much for your speech. My name is Bettina, I'm from Berlin. So I have a question. You've been talking about this great glamorous picture we have from China, this country that has managed to free millions and hundreds of millions of people from poverty within a few decades. And when we think about what China can teach us about transformation, it might be a narrative. They have a great story to tell. And it really, it makes sense. It is inspiring, or it is actually, it's impressive. But when we talk about control, we look at the social credit system that has been implemented or is being implemented right now. So this great narrative could actually spread, and other authoritarian regimes could be interested in the social credit system in order to implement the same kind of control over their citizens. So in your expertise, do you think it is likely to happen that this social credit system could be sold or spread to countries like Vietnam or Russia, or somehow be copied? Thank you.
Stein.
Well, as it happens, I'm coming back to Berlin in 2 or 3 weeks to talk about the social credit system on another occasion. Yes, there is, of course, every danger that it will be copied. This is what I mean. If I were a dictator today, I would write to Beijing and learn how it is done. And that system is draconian. You know, within that system, the authorities knows everything about the individual, everything. And that information is used to reward or punish citizens in their daily lives. For example, their ability to travel, to leave the country, or even the right to go on high-speed trains rather than slow trains. So it will be copied. It will be copied. You know, we are not immune to this danger ourselves, but we do have democratic oversight, which is, with all its imperfections, a totally different setting. I mean, when I came through Tegel Airport yesterday, facial recognition technique was used to go through the automatic passport control. So it's there, but there is oversight. That makes all the difference. It is being copied, it will be copied, yes.
Okay, another question, please.
Thanks very much. Jessica Berlin, I'm the managing director of Construct. I used to work in security and foreign policy myself, and also previously lived in China. And my question, I could ask many questions, but I'll keep it to one.
Thank you.
What do you consider... What was missing, I think, from this discussion, other than a Chinese counter perspective, is the role that Western industrialized countries play in indeed empowering and giving legitimacy to the regime. China is not just it's not just big. I mean, it's critical. It's crucial, and our way of life hangs also on doing business with China. This is trillions in trade, and so to criticize their dictatorship on the one hand and finance it on the other is something that we also need to acknowledge. So what would be your comments and your take on our shared responsibility in enabling the Chinese state to become what it has?
Stein.
Well, since I've been asked this question many times, my answer to that is that I would not advocate non-engagement with China. I'm in favor of engagement with China on all levels, including on the academic level, which I've done myself. So it's not non-engagement. But my advocacy is for direct talk to the Chinese leaders, that they should be confronted. Now, it's outrageous, for example, that they can introduce an total police state in Xinjiang. And there is silence in the world about it. There is silence in the Muslim world about it. This is Muslims being prosecuted. The Muslim countries have nothing to say. The rest of us have nothing to say. They're getting away with it. They should not be allowed to get away. And talking, in this case, would be very effective, because the Chinese leaders put great emphasis on their authority, their position in the world, their respect. But it has to be collective. There's no use that an individual politician speaks out. It has to be collective. The European Union is important here. Unfortunately, within the European Union, has been impossible to mobilize a collective voice against the repression in China. But it is speaking straight talk to the men in black in Beijing against their oppression at home and their aggression abroad. And I am absolutely certain that if we could get our act together and speak collectively, it would be very effective.
And here's one other question in the second row.
Thank you very much. My name is Rania Scheele. I'm a program director, international affairs for the Körber Stiftung, a German foundation as well. My question relates to your final words about the messy reality of democracy as opposed to the order of the Chinese dictatorship. And it, perhaps to take it a bit broader, I wonder about the attractiveness of democratic regimes as opposed to autocratic ones. Because recently I came across a statistic that said that in 35 African countries, the majority of people actually now prefers the Chinese model to the American one. I mean, we can question that, but at least it carries some sort of attractiveness for countries that are hungry for change and also hungry for economic development. And I wonder what we as democratic states can actually do to appear more attractive, not only in being messy and not as orderly, but also in sort of delivering to the people that are hungry for change.
Stein.
Well, we can do our business well. I mean, we can govern well and set an example. We're not doing particularly well on that right now. I think that not only in this question, but in much of what we are discussing here today, the question of good, effective governance in our systems is very important. Proper delivery, responsiveness, dealing with the problems. So I think that the best we can do is to set an example. We're not doing that very well. But then we also need to be assertive. We need to have confidence in our own system. Personally, I think that the main function of deliberation, which we have been speaking about, is to improve the democratic culture, to improve our own understanding of ourselves and each other as the cultural foundations of democracy. So I think, you know, if we concentrate and work hard on doing our own thing well, we will set an example to others. Now, don't worry too much about this. I mean, in the world, it is the democratic way of life that has admiration. China's problem is that it has no friends in the world, no genuine friends. It has some allies that it is paying for, buying. There's no genuine friends. But the open society model has a very high level of attractiveness in terms of moral superiority. So don't worry too much about it. But we need to do our things well.
I think we have time for one question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Martin from Berlin, and I just want to ask one question, and it is, when you say you should make a point to the Chinese government or to Chinese anywhere or whatever, I just wonder from which moral standpoint? Because, I mean, even our societies live on behalf of nature, of exploiting other cultures and all that. I just wonder where you're, and to me it sounds a little sad actually listening to you. It sounds like that you still can't understand how this kind of political system can outperform a formal British Empire based on colonialism. I mean, from which moral standpoint shall we address something? Where do you come, where do you take your idealistic point of view of a democratic, I don't get it, honestly.
Thank you.
Is it theoretically or?
Stein.
Well, the Chinese model is not outperforming the competition. It is being outperformed by the competition. In its own region, it is surrounded by other countries that are performing in terms of economic progress and other forms of progress much better than the Chinese system. So it is not a system that performs very well. Now, the moral argument is that democracy is funded on the principle of individual freedom, that people are free to live their lives in dignity by their own design. Now that is the moral high ground that tops with no competition any kind of moral proposition that comes from the authoritarian countries, from the authoritarian systems. So of course we have the moral high ground if we were able to claim it with more confidence than we today do.